Good morning, Year 7. I'm going to start off today's lesson with a quick quiz to help you try and remember some of the things that we've been studying this year. So I want you to just have a go at these 4 questions, please. So the first question is, what is the code for a characteristic called? Second question, what are the 3 states of matter? Question 3, what is the pH of a strong alkali? So that's going to be a number. And what are forces measured in? So what's the unit that we use to measure forces? Okay, so the answer to question 1 is a gene. A few of you got that wrong in the quiz that we did, so hopefully you are aware that genes code for characteristics and they're found in the nuclei of a cell. 3 states of matter: solid, liquid and gas. pH of a strong alkali would be 13 or 14. So you remember last week we were looking at strong acids in the quiz, and they had a number of 1 or 2. And then alkali is the other end of the scale, if you like, so it goes up to 13. Well, the scale goes up to 14, so either 13 or 14 would indicate a very strong alkali. And then finally, forces are measured in newtons. Remember, we used the Newton meter to measure the weight of various things, didn't we? On the little spring, do you remember? We hung them on the spring, and that was the unit in newtons that we used. Okay, so last lesson we looked at inherited and environmental causes of variation, and today we are going to be looking at the difference between what we call continuous and discontinuous variation, and we'll be explaining the meaning of those 2 words in today's lesson. We will then be moving on to look at graphs of variation, and your submission task is going to be to draw a graph. Okay, so here is something for you to think about. We've got 6 different variations that occur in humans, and I want you to think about what the difference is between the list of variations on the left and the list of variations on the right. Think about the type of values that you record if you were going to record that information. So the differences between those features, the ones on the left, there were only a few options that you could have had, and you fall into one of those categories. So for example, you can either roll your tongue or you can't roll your tongue, and that type of variation is known as discontinuous, where there's specific groups that you fall into. Continuous variation is slightly different, so the column on the right hand side contained features where you can be any value within a certain range. So examples include height, where you can be very, very short right the way up to very, very tall, or any value within those ranges, and that's known as continuous variation. Okay, so I want you to think about what it is that causes these types of variation. So on the left hand side we've got discontinuous variables, and we've said that you fall into one group within those. So for example, you will have one blood group, and you might have a specific eye colour, and you can either roll your tongue or you can't. Yeah, and so we did some of those in the survey that you did on Monday, and those characteristics are purely caused by the genes that you've inherited from your parents. Okay, so that means that you would have inherited certain genes from your mum, certain genes from your dad, which will enable you to roll your tongue. And you could have a look at that, see whether your mum and dad can roll your tongue, and that will give you a hint as to who you may have inherited your tongue rolling capabilities from. Okay, but that's purely genetic. You can't change whether you can roll your tongue or not. You can't change your eye colour. You can't change your blood group. You were born with those characteristics. On the right hand side we've got what we call continuous variables, where there is a range of values Okay, so you had a range. Okay, so all of these characteristics here are going to have a certain range. So for example, weight is going to be, if we looked at the whole human population, the weight would be very small for babies up to sort of large adults, and the weight is going to increase, and you can be any weight in between there. Similarly with running speed, you know, if you're an Olympic athlete, you're going to be really, really fast. And most people are somewhere in the middle as far as, say, we were going to run 100 meters, for example. Okay, and similarly with length of arm, if we measured the lengths of arms, a little baby would have a very short length of arm, whereas a very, very tall adult is likely to have a much bigger length of arm, and your arm will be anywhere in between. Now, when you have a range like that, the chances are that it's due to both genes that you've inherited from your parents. So, for example, if we look at running speed, you may have inherited certain genes that mean that your muscles are suited to sprinting, for example. But in addition to that, the environment will also have a massive influence on whether or not you can run very fast. So how much you train is going to have an influence, isn't it? And also your diet, for example, might influence how fast you can run. So for example, if you want to develop lots of muscles for running and things like that, then you would eat a diet very high in protein, for example. So the environment can also influence those characteristics. So it's important that genes and environment, okay, interact, if you like, to give you that variation. And that's shown by the variation occurring between a whole range of different values. Okay, so now we're going to look at some data that we collected from last lesson, and 11 of you managed to complete the survey, so we're going to be using that data. And here we have a graph of your results, and what we're going to think about for each one of these questions is whether or not the data is continuous or discontinuous. So does the data vary from one value right the way up to the other value, or are there discrete categories that it falls into? So first of all, can you roll your tongue? So think about that just for a second. Is that going to be discontinuous or continuous? Okay, so the answer to this one is that this is discontinuous data, because you either can roll your tongue or you can't, and there's nowhere in between. Okay, so is your thumb straight or curved? So this are the results from our survey. Do you think that's continuous or discontinuous? Okay, there's definite groups there, so that's another example of discontinuous variation. Okay, so a few of you are unsure, but if we had all been in class, we would have been able to distinguish those people who had very curved thumbs from those people who had very straight thumbs. Okay, can you ride a bike? Okay. Is it continuous or discontinuous? See, again, this is discontinuous, because you either can or can't. I did put in I don't know as one of the options, because I decided you might not ever have seen a bike. Some people might not have a bike and wouldn't necessarily know whether they could ride it or not, but everybody who'd completed a survey could ride a bike, so that's continuous data. Okay, how tall are you in centimetres? So you had to measure your height this time. What do you think? Do you think that data is continuous or discontinuous? Okay, so this data is continuous, and the reason that it's continuous, if you notice, is that your height can basically be between 130 in our survey up to 179. Okay, so what I've done here is you can see straight away that this is sort of different data, can't you? Because we've got ranges that people are going to be in. So it's the height range. You can be anywhere between here. So what that means is this is the data that people sent in. I've added this data. You'll notice that these numbers don't add up to the number of people over here, and that's because I added the data to Mrs. Ritchie's class data, because it gave us a better pattern and gave us more data. So I haven't put her individual height data down, but I have put our class data down. So for example, if we look at 158 centimeters, somebody was 158 centimeters, so they would have been in this range here. Okay, so that would have been that person there, one of those people there. Yeah, 150 would have been in the same category. Okay, 164 would have been down in this category here. Okay, and then there would have been one person, for example, who was 175. If we look at that, that's that person there in that category. Okay, and then the 130 to 139 category, that's that person there. So there's only one person in that category. There's only one person in that category. Okay, and what you will notice here is that you have some very short people. Not very short, but some people who are shorter, some people who are much taller, but the majority of people tend to be sort of in the middle. Okay, and we're going to be looking at patterns of how height varies a little bit later on in your submission task. Because the ranges go, because there is a range of data, we could say that this data is continuous. Okay, what about this one? What do you think? What colour are your eyes? Is that continuous or discontinuous? Okay, hopefully you are aware by now that that's discontinuous data because there are specific categories for eye colour. You know, here we've got blue, green, brown eyes. Most people have brown eyes in our class, but because they're specific categories, it's discontinuous variation. Okay, so here are some results for an older year class. This is your submission task. First thing I'd like you to do is to draw a graph of the data. I'll give you an example on the next slide, how to do that. And then I want you to answer the questions saying how, first of all, do we know that the class is older? Explain whether you think height is a discontinuous or a continuous variable. And then finally, do you think height is controlled by the genes, the environment, or both? And I'd like you to explain why. So this graph helps you see what sort of graph you should draw using that data. Now, obviously, you're going to need to change the values here. Because the table that I've given you has different ranges. So, for example, that isn't the smallest range in your data table. So you're going to need to go back and you're going to need to put the ranges from the table along the bottom, and then you just plot frequency on the y-axis. So 1 would be the number of people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the number of people. So for example, in the 180 to 189 range, there are 5 people. Okay, so hopefully your graph will look like something like that when you've plotted the data. Okay, so I'd like you to upload your graph and also the answers to the questions to Show My Homework. Okay, so you need to answer those 4 questions and then upload all of that information to Show My Homework. There is an extension task for those of you who finish early on the next slide. Okay, so your extension task is to look at the Activate textbook pages that I've attached to Show My Homework, to read through the information on variation and make some extra notes. See if you can find an extra 3 facts relating to today's lesson. Okay, thank you very much. Off you go.